saving every dripping from the bacon pan, stringing beans on a needle before the frost, reading lye water to know when the corn was ready. These were skills that kept a mountain family fed. The hands that held them are mostly gone. Here are 30 oddly useful hillbilly survival hacks that actually work. The tin sat on the back of the stove all year. A squat coffee can or old lard pail filled with pale amber fat that never fully hardened. Every morning after the bacon came off the skillet, she tipped the pan and poured the drippings in, straining out the black bits. You never washed that tin. You never refrigerated it. The fat cycled naturally. Fresh drippings on top, older fat used from the bottom, and it stayed sweet and functional for months without spoiling. It greased the skillet for cornbread. It wilted the lettuce. It finished the green beans. It carried the flavor of every piece of pork that had ever cooked in that kitchen, layered into something richer than any single ingredient could manage. Through the 1930s and 40s, lard came in 50-pound tin pails from the store, but bacon grease was free. It cost nothing but the habit of attention. When she stopped cooking, nobody thought to save the tin. That was the first thing that went. The lettuce had to be fresh, still cool from the garden, because the whole point was the contrast. You filled a wash pan with torn green leaf lettuce and thin-sliced spring onions, salted it light, and went to the skillet. The grease had to be smoking, not warm, not hot, smoking, with a shimmer past ready. You poured it straight over the raw greens in one long stream, moving slow so the heat reached every corner, and the lettuce collapsed on contact with a hiss, wilting to a third of its volume in seconds. A splash of apple cider vinegar went in next, and sometimes crumbled bacon across the top. Kilt lettuce appeared on Appalachian tables from late March through late May in Harlan County and across the Kentucky mountains when the new garden was coming in and the winter's preserved food was finally running thin. She made it in a wash pan big enough for the whole family and served it piping hot. Nobody has gotten the pour right since she left. The needle went through the wide belly of each bean, and you slid it down the doubled thread with a finger's width of space before threading the next. By August, the porch rafters of every Appalachian farmhouse were hung with long strings of green beans drying in the mountain air, a technique the Cherokee had practiced long before the Scots-Irish settlers arrived to learn it from them. Those settlers called them leather breeches because after 6 to 8 weeks, the pods shriveled and curled and went the color of old leather left out in the rain. Heirloom varieties used for drying had names like Lazy Wife and Turkey Craw. Come winter, you soaked a string overnight and cooked the beans for 3 hours with a piece of fatback, and what came out bore no resemblance to fresh green beans. The drying concentrated the flavor into something deep and beefy, and the pot liquor in the bottom of the pot, as Chef Sean Brock described it, tasted like roast beef. The technique required no electricity, no jars, no equipment, just a needle, thread, and a covered porch. Soup beans were started before anyone else was awake. The pintos had soaked overnight, and by the time the kitchen was light enough to see, she had a piece of fatback already browning in the bottom of the pot. Water in to cover, lid on low, and the beans cooked all morning without anyone being asked to watch. She knew by the smell when they were getting close. Soup beans were Monday food in most Appalachian households. The anchor of the week, something you could eat twice in a day without complaint because the pot just got better as the hours went on. By the 1950s, pinto beans ran around 14 cents a pound at the company store, and a pound could feed a family of 6 if the cornbread was thick. The beans went into the bowl, and the cornbread went in beside them. You used the bread to push the beans onto the spoon because that was the right way, and everyone knew it without being told. The variations were as personal as handwriting, and hers was the only one that tasted right. Before there was a smokehouse on the property, and many families never had one, there was the salt box, and it did the same work by different means. After the November butchering, cuts that couldn't be eaten fresh went into a wooden box packed with dry salt. The rule was absolute. Every surface had to be covered, pressed in by hand to leave nothing exposed. Salt packing drew out the moisture bacteria needed, working slowly until the meat was stable enough to last well into the following summer. A whole ham might need 4 to 6 weeks under salt. Smaller slabs of side meat, 2. The salt was often cut with brown sugar and a little saltpeter, a formula passed by watching, never by measuring. In 1930s Appalachia, a 50-pound bag of plain salt cost less than $1 and was one of the most critical purchases made each fall. The salt box required nothing but cold air, the salt, and the knowledge of how thick to pack it. That last part was the hardest thing to hold on to. Crackling cornbread was what happened when nothing went to waste. After rendering lard from fresh pork fat, a process that left behind small, crispy browned bits of skin called cracklings, those bits went straight into the batter. You mixed white cornmeal, baking soda, buttermilk, and a beaten egg, folded the cracklings in, and poured the whole thing into a cast iron skillet that had been greased and heated in a 425-degree oven until nearly smoking. The batter hitting that hot iron produced a low, satisfied hiss, the sound that told you the crust was already forming. The cracklings distributed through the loaf as it baked, each one holding a pocket of rendered fat that kept the surrounding crumb moist and gave the finished bread a texture somewhere between ordinary cornbread and something with no name. Crackling cornbread appears in the Foxfire Book of Appalachian Cookery as one of the most widely remembered dishes of mountain households, from West Virginia down through northern Georgia. The skillet was the whole secret. Cold pan, flat bread. Hot pan, something worth remembering. Nobody measured the cornmeal. You wet your hands, scooped from the bag, added salt water until the meal clumped without falling apart, and shaped it into an oval in your palms, flat on the bottom, rounded on top. Corn pone was older than the cast iron skillet itself. The earliest versions were baked on a hoe blade held over an open fire, which is where the name hoe cake came from in the communities that used both words interchangeably. Pone was the bread of weeks when a family couldn't spare the buttermilk or eggs that cornbread required. Nothing but meal, water, salt, and heat. The outside went hard and golden, developing a crust that crackled under pressure, while the inside stayed dense and slightly gummy, and that texture was the point. It held up in a bowl of beans without dissolving. You never used a spoon to shape it. If you needed a spoon, you weren't ready to make it. She shaped 12 pones in the time it took most people to find a recipe card, moving through the routine so automatically she could do it in the dark, and everyone came out the same. In August, when the pole bean crop came in faster than any one family could handle, the neighbors came. Chairs went out on the porch, wash pans filled with freshly pulled beans, and the work started. Break the tip, pull the string down the pod, snap the bean, drop it in. The sound was specific: a dry snap, a soft rustle, a hollow knock against the tin, hour after hour, set under conversation and children running in the yard. Bean stringing days were documented as community cooperative events across Appalachia as far back as the early 1900s. Women brought their best stories to bean stringing days. Some of those conversations are the last clear memory certain families hold of grandmothers now gone. Her voice, the smell of the beans, the weight of the pan. The beans went into jars or leather breeches or that night's supper. The day those hands made together was harder to put up. Pot liquor was the liquid left in the pot after a long cook of greens with pork, dark, glossy, smelling of collards and ham and something mineral underneath. In mountain households, it was not a byproduct to discard, but a dish in its own right, poured into a tin cup and drunk while the greens were being plated, or used to soak the cornbread so it could carry more flavor to the mouth per bite. The mineral content was genuinely high. A long cook drew calcium, iron, and B vitamins from the greens that would otherwise be lost. And mountain people understood this without nutritional vocabulary, but with hard practical knowledge passed across generations. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt entered a public debate about whether pot liquor should be drunk as broth or sopped with cornbread. A moment that tells you something about how seriously this liquid was regarded. The ones who knew it best always drank it straight from the cup first, still hot enough to steam. When she left the kitchen for the last time, that cup went cold, and nobody thought to fill it. She made the mush at night when supper was done, because it needed all night to set. Cornmeal went into salted boiling water, and she stirred it until it thickened past porridge, dense enough to hold the spoon's path for a moment before closing. A process that took 40 minutes of constant attention. She poured it into a bread loaf pan, smoothed the top flat, and left it on the counter until morning. By dawn, it had firmed into a sliceable loaf. She cut it into half-inch slabs and fried each one in bacon grease until the outside was golden and crisped while the inside stayed soft. Called mush by some families in the hill communities of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, fried cornmeal mush was food that required nothing special and wasted nothing. Every bit left from supper became something better at breakfast. The crackle of the crust is what the children who grew up on it still remember. Their grandchildren do not know the dish exists. The ones who did not know the preparation could have killed themselves. Pokeweed, the tall-stalked plant with dark purple berries that grew wild along Appalachian roadsides, contained phytolactotoxin through every part of its structure. Eating it raw or undercooked caused vomiting, convulsions, and in documented cases, death. But the people who knew understood that young spring leaves, harvested when the plant was still under a foot high, could be made safe through a preparation that could not be shortened. You brought a pot to a full rolling boil, added the leaves, cooked 15 minutes, and drained every drop. Fresh water, back to the boil, cook again, drain again. Fresh water a third time, cook, drain. Only after 3 full cycles did the greens go into the skillet with bacon grease and onion, with scrambled egg folded in at the end. Salad was the Old English word for cooked greens, carried into Appalachian speech by early settlers. The dish was celebrated each June at the Poke Salad Festival in Harlan, Kentucky. You could only earn it by knowing what nobody had written down. Hominy started with dried corn soaked in lye water, an alkaline solution made from wood ash, until the hull of each kernel loosened and the corn swelled to nearly twice its size. The process was nixtamalization, though that word never appeared in mountain kitchens where it had been practiced for generations. The critical knowledge was how to make the lye water right. Wood ash from a clean hardwood fire went into a barrel. Water poured through slowly and collected below, and the resulting liquid had to be strong enough to float a raw egg before it was ready. Too weak, and the corn would not hull. Too strong, and it dissolved. She knew by the color and the way it moved, knowledge learned by watching her grandmother, never by asking. In Cherokee cooking, nixtamalization of corn dated back centuries before European contact, and the Appalachian settlers who inherited the technique gained one of the most significant food processes in North American history. The hominy that came out had a silky, tender chew that nothing canned has matched. By late September, when the garden was giving its last and the cold was moving down off the ridges, she was already at the stove with every salvageable vegetable she could pull. Green tomatoes, hot peppers, cabbage, onions, snap beans, chopping it fine and cooking it down with vinegar, mustard seed, turmeric, and sugar into chowchow. It had an eye-watering smell while it cooked and an entirely different smell once it hit the jar, settling into something sharp and sweet and bright that lasted all winter on a spoon of beans or a piece of fatback. Chowchow was the insurance policy against a bland February, the condiment built from everything the garden had left before the first hard freeze took it. Nothing went to the compost that could still be put up. The practice of pickling end-of-garden vegetables into a spiced relish was documented across Appalachia and the broader American South from at least the mid-19th century, with regional variations in heat from Virginia down through Georgia. Once the jars sealed with that pop, the winter felt a little shorter. Rendering lard was a whole-day affair that happened once a year after the November hog killing, when the fat back and leaf lard were cut away in thick slabs and set to melt in the biggest cast-iron pot over a low wood fire outside. You stirred with a long paddle to keep the fat from scorching, watching the solid white chunks shrink and liquefy over several hours until only the cracklings were left. Small, brown, crispy pieces of skin floating in clear golden fat. The lard got ladled into crocks while it was still liquid and hardened white and smooth by morning. Leaf lard, the fat from around the kidneys, was considered the finest grade, mild enough for pie crust and biscuits without adding a heavy pork flavor. A well-rendered crock kept most of a year in a cool pantry. The cracklings left behind were salted and eaten warm, or saved for crackling cornbread. Nothing in the rendering process was wasted. Not a drop. You had to know the creek bottoms to find them, and you had to know the exact week, because a pawpaw not yet ripe was hard and bitter and useless, and a pawpaw one day past ready was already fermenting on the ground with the yellow jackets on it. The Asimina triloba, North America's largest native fruit, tasting of banana mixed with vanilla and something almost tropical, ripened for about 3 weeks in late August through September in the creek hollows of Appalachia, and the families who ate them had their patches marked in memory since their grandparents' time. You pressed the skin gently. If it gave like a ripe avocado, it was ready. You carried them home wrapped in a shirt because nothing bruised faster, and ate them the same day or turned them into pawpaw butter before the next sunrise. Lewis and Clark documented pawpaws on their 1804 expedition as a critical food source during lean stretches. She knew the patch, the week, and the press test. The trees are still out there. The knowledge of where to look is getting harder to find. They called them dry landfish, or hickory chickens, depending on which hollow you came from. And the name told you how they were eaten. Cut the morel in half, soak it in salt water to chase out whatever was living inside, dust it in cornmeal, and fry it in bacon grease until crisp and golden and smelling of the woods and the skillet at the same time. Morels appeared for 2 to 3 weeks each spring in the hardwood forests of Appalachia, and the people who found them were not going to tell you where their patch was. Ever. Finding morels required knowing which trees they grew near, what the soil smelled like when conditions were right, and how to tell a true morel from a false morel, which was toxic enough to make the uninformed wish they had asked. Grandmothers guarded their spots the way some people guard money. Some patches stayed in families for 4 generations. The locations are still not shared with people who need to be told what to look for. The head went to whoever had earned it, usually the grandmother who cooked the squirrel, and the one least likely to waste the part most people had decided wasn't worth bothering with. After the squirrel was stewed and the meat pulled from the legs and back, the head got set aside, and she cracked it open with the handle of a spoon and dug the brains out with the same casual economy she applied to everything else. Squirrel brains were considered a delicacy at Appalachian tables, small and rich and faintly sweet, eaten plain or scrambled into eggs, a use of the whole animal that dated to the earliest settlement of the mountains, when hunters who depended on small game could not afford to leave anything on the table. The children watched with the fascinated horror children reserve for adults doing things that seem impossible. Some grew up to find the brains on their plate without thinking twice. Others left the room. The ones who left the room are still missing something they cannot name. The shells were so hard that a hammer usually sent them skittering before cracking them, and a nutcracker was a joke. So the old cooks let the black walnuts dry in the sun for a week until the outer green husk had blackened and shrunk, then drove over them with the car. Just backed the rear tire down a row of walnuts on concrete, slow, and the shells cracked just enough to get a pick into without crushing the meat inside. Black walnuts had a flavor more complex than any commercial walnut, deeper, almost tannic, with a richness that made every recipe it touched taste more like itself. Children in Appalachian communities earned pocket money through the 1940s and 50s by gathering fallen black walnuts, shelling them, and selling the meat at general stores for a few cents a pound. The stain from the husks turned your hands dark brown for a week, and nothing washed it off. She kept a jar of the shelled meat in the freezer door all winter for cookies and cakes that tasted like nowhere else on earth. When the jar ran out, it was just a jar. Sorghum making was a community event that happened once a year in early fall, when the tall cane was cut and hauled to whichever neighbor had the mill. A horse walked slow circles turning the press that squeezed the pale green juice from the cane stalks, and the juice ran off into a long, flat, evaporating pan set over a low fire, tended by the most experienced cook in the group, the one who knew how to skim the rising green foam and who read the color shift from pale yellow through amber to the deep dark brown that meant the sorghum was done. Too early and the syrup fermented in the jar. Too late and it burned bitter. The whole community brought their cane and shared the day's labor, and the sorghum got divided by how much cane each family had contributed. A gallon of good sorghum molasses sweetened a winter's worth of cornbread batter, gingerbread, and stack cake. The skill of reading the pan, knowing by color and smell when to pull it off, went with the last people who stood long enough at enough stir-offs to learn it. The smell told you before the calendar did. Sometime in April, earlier on south-facing slopes, later in the deep creek hollows, the ramps came up, and you could smell them before you reached the patch. A sharp, insistent mix of garlic and wild onion that clung to your hands for days and to your breath for longer. Ramps, Allium tricoccum, the wild leek native to the Appalachian Mountains, were among the first fresh food available after a long winter of beans and dried meat and canned vegetables, and mountain families treated them as medicine as much as food. You fried them in bacon grease with potatoes and eggs, or added them to the bean pot for a flavor that changed the character of the whole meal. The Ramp Festival in Richwood, West Virginia, has run since 1939, one of the oldest community food festivals in the region. She knew the patch on the hillside behind the house, knew the week it would be ready, and she was there every spring without fail. The smell still hits before you see the leaves. Whether you love it or hate it, you know it the moment it finds you. After the hog killing, when every good cut had been smoked or salted, the head came in from the cold and went into the biggest pot in the house. Souse, head cheese, was what you made when you refused to waste the skull, and what came out bore almost no resemblance to what went in. The whole head simmered for hours until the meat fell from the bones and the broth reduced into something thick with natural gelatin. The meat was picked off every bone by hand, the cheeks, the jowl, the tongue, the small pieces from around the ears, and mixed with cider vinegar, black pepper, red pepper, and sage, then packed tightly into a loaf pan. As it cooled, the gelatin set the meat into a firm, sliceable loaf eaten cold, cut thin on cornbread. What entered that pot looking like nothing anyone would choose came out as a delicacy sharp with vinegar and redolent of pork, and a single hog head produced enough souse to last 2 weeks. Nothing about the hog was wasted, the head least of all. Spoon bread occupied the space between cornbread and a soufflé, baked in a buttered dish and served with a spoon because it was too soft to cut, with a texture somewhere between pudding and custard and nothing else you had a word for. The African-American contribution to Appalachian cooking ran deep, and spoon bread was one of the clearest examples. A dish with roots in the indigenous hominy traditions of the Southeast, refined through the kitchens of black cooks across the Virginia and Carolina mountains, and passed into the broader regional food culture. Made with cornmeal, eggs, butter, and milk, the eggs beaten separately so the whites could be folded in at the end, it required a confident hand because the margin between perfect and collapsed was narrow. Good spoon bread arrived at the table with a golden crust and a quivering interior that fell the moment you pressed the spoon in, and it existed fully only in the first 5 minutes after it came from the oven. She knew the oven's temper and the timing, and she never once had to check it twice. When she stopped making it, it stopped existing. The ham went in before Christmas and came out the following December. Salt packing came first, every surface rubbed and covered. Then the ham sat in the salt box for 4 to 6 weeks until the cure worked through to the bone. After that, it went to the smokehouse on a hook, and hickory smoke ran cold and steady for weeks, sealing the outside and flavoring the meat down through the fat. A properly cured Appalachian smokehouse ham needed no refrigeration. It could hang in a cool cellar for a year and improve. When Christmas arrived and the ham was finally brought in, she carried it with both hands and set it on the counter, and the kitchen changed the moment the smokehouse door opened. That deep, sweet, smoky smell that meant the year had turned out all right. The last one she brought in was the last one that smelled like that. Sourwood honey came from a single tree, Oxydendrum arboreum, which bloomed in July along the ridges of the southern Appalachians and produced a nectar so particular that the honey made from it tasted like nothing else the bees could make anywhere else. It was lighter in color than clover honey, almost water white, with a faint caramel note and a slight anise finish. Mountain beekeepers moved their hives to higher elevations in late June specifically to catch the sourwood bloom. Sourwood honey was also used as a wound dressing in Appalachian folk medicine, applied directly to cuts and burns. Its low moisture content and natural antimicrobial properties made it genuinely effective, a practice documented well before modern science named the mechanism. She kept a jar on the shelf above the stove and reached for it as both sweetener and medicine, never drawing a line between the two. After months of dried beans and canned goods and salt meat, the first creasy greens of late winter were worth walking up a cold hillside to find. Cardamine hirsuta, field cress, called creasy greens across Appalachia, grew low and dense on frost-covered slopes from January through March, one of the only fresh plants before spring arrived. Cherokee communities had relied on creasy greens as a winter staple for generations before European settlement, and the settlers who learned from them knew that those dark little leaves, bitter when raw, softened in bacon grease into something that tasted of iron and green and the particular relief of eating something alive after months of preserved food. You fried them fast and ate them hot with cornbread. She knew every reliable patch within walking distance of the house. Nobody thought to ask her where they were before it was too late. The hickory nutshells that most people threw away after cracking were the ones she saved, crushed fine with the back of a flat iron on the hearthstone, then boiled in a large pot of water until the fat that lived inside the shell itself rose to the surface and could be skimmed off. The resulting liquid, called hickory milk in the communities that made it, was a fat-rich cooking medium with a deep, smoky, nutty flavor that had no commercial equivalent. The technique came from Cherokee cooking, where it had been used for centuries to enrich cornbread batter and hominy in stews, a practice documented in the ethnobotanical records of southern Appalachian communities. You added it in place of lard when lard was scarce, or alongside it when you wanted the cornbread to taste like the mountain itself in autumn. The shells that had no other use became the most flavorful thing in the kitchen. When the kitchens went quiet, that flavor went with them. The dandelions came up everywhere and nobody planted them. Every yard and fence line across Appalachia produced a crop each spring, and the families who paid attention harvested 2 foods from the same weed for free. The young leaves, pulled before the flower opened, went into a skillet of bacon grease, wilted fast and eaten with cornbread. The flowers went into a different pot, steeped in boiling water, strained, combined with sugar, lemon juice, and pectin, and cooked into a golden jelly that tasted of honey and something floral and entirely unlike anything from a grocery shelf. Dandelion jelly was a common Appalachian practice through the mid-20th century, showing up at church sales and county fairs and on the tables of women who understood that free food hiding in plain sight was still food. When she stopped making it, the dandelions kept coming up. The jelly did not. You had to wait for the frost. A wild persimmon, Diospyros virginiana, growing along creek banks and field edges across the Appalachian foothills, was aggressively astringent before the first hard freeze, puckering your mouth the moment you bit in. After the frost, the same fruit became something else, soft and orange and sweet, with a honey-rich depth that surprised people who had only known the bitter version. The old cooks gathered them from the ground in November and December after they had fallen naturally, because a persimmon that drops on its own is ready and one pulled from the branch probably is not. Persimmon pudding, dense, spiced, baked in a deep dish until it set between cake and custard, was the classic Appalachian use, made from pulp pressed through a colander to remove the seeds and skin. She knew which trees bore the sweetest fruit. She never wrote it down. That knowledge is in the ground with her now. Cured meat packed in lard was the last line of preservation, used when the smokehouse was full and the salt box was spent, and there was still more meat than the winter would safely carry any other way. The cured cuts went into a clay crock, pressed tight, and rendered lard was poured warm over the top until the meat was sealed beneath a solid white cap of fat. Kept in a cool cellar, that barrier preserved the meat for months. You reached in through the winter and pulled out whatever you needed, wiped off the fat, and cooked it. The lard going back in or straight into the skillet, nothing wasted. The Foxfire volumes documented fat-sealed crocks as standard practice in Depression-era Appalachian households well into the 1950s. The crock sat on the cellar shelf until the last person who knew to fill it was gone. Then it just sat. When there was no fruit, she made the pie anyway. Vinegar pie was the answer to wanting something sweet when the orchard had failed and the preserves had run out and it was February. The filling required almost nothing. Eggs, butter, sugar, flour, and apple cider vinegar, beaten together, poured into a plain pastry shell, baked until it set into something custardy and sharp and sweet at the same time. The vinegar stood in for fruit the way resourcefulness always stood in for abundance in those kitchens. Not perfectly, but good enough and sometimes better than expected. Versions of vinegar pie appeared across the American South and Appalachia through the 1930s and 40s, made by women who set the table with what they had. The recipe was never written down in her house. It lived in the pour and the knowing of when sharp was too sharp. It stopped the day she did. Possum and sweet potatoes was the kind of backwoods dinner that kept families fed through the leanest winters. When hunting was luck and store meat was too dear, possum became fair game, slow roasted in the hearth until tender and rich. Paired with syrupy baked sweet potatoes, the dish filled the kitchen with a deep, smoky aroma that wrapped around every soul inside. The meat's wild flavor was softened by the caramel sweetness of the potatoes, balancing the meal just right. No one cooked it for show. It was made from necessity and served with pride. In those hills, feeding your family meant using what the woods offered, without apology or waste. Preparing it took skill, patience, and courage, the kind born from survival, not luxury. Each bite carried the taste of the land, wild and honest as the people who cooked it. For visitors, it was daring. For locals, it was life. Possum and sweet potatoes told the story of mountain living, rough, resourceful, and full of heart. It was food that asked nothing fancy, only respect for what was given and gratitude for what it provided. Campfire Dutch oven. Peach cobbler turned rugged campsites into places of sweet reward after days of hard labor. Hunters or homesteaders opened precious cans of peaches saved from summer and poured them into a cast iron pot, topping them with biscuit dough mixed on the spot. The lid was covered with glowing coals, and the cobbler baked slowly as night settled over the mountains. The scent of fruit and butter rose into the cool air, drawing every tired traveler toward the fire. When the lid lifted, golden crust revealed bubbling peach syrup that dripped onto tin plates. This dessert was more than a treat. It was proof that even in the wilds, a taste of comfort and celebration was possible. Children scraped the pot clean while adults savored the rare sweetness, knowing the peaches might be the only fruit for weeks. Modern camping desserts cannot match the simple magic of cobbler baked under stars with nothing but iron, fire, and patience to guide it. Fried catfish roe was once a prized seasonal delicacy in southern fishing communities, celebrated for its crisp texture and savory flavor. When fishermen brought in catfish, nothing was wasted, and the roe was dredged in cornmeal and fried until golden. It was often served alongside hush puppies or simple greens, making a meal that felt indulgent despite its humble origins. Families valued it as a rare treat tied to the rhythms of the river, where seasonal catches dictated what appeared on the table. Children grew up with memories of this dish as a reward for long days spent fishing with parents or grandparents. It reflected a time when local waters directly fed households and traditions. Today, fried catfish roe has nearly disappeared, pushed aside by changing tastes and concerns about sourcing. Few restaurants still serve it, and many younger Southerners have never tasted it. Its loss marks a fading link between people and the waterways that once sustained them, leaving it more a memory than a menu item. Salt-rising bread with bacon drippings offered a rich and rustic loaf that captured the art of natural fermentation long before packaged yeast became common. Grandmothers began the process with a warm starter of cornmeal and scalded milk that sat overnight until wild bacteria created a distinct cheesy aroma. This slow magic produced a dense yet tender bread with a flavor unlike any other, slightly tangy and wonderfully fragrant. To heighten the richness, they brushed the baked loaf with hot bacon drippings, allowing the savory fat to seep into the crust and perfume the kitchen. Families enjoyed thick slices for breakfast with fresh butter or alongside hearty soups for supper. The bread required patience and trust in tradition, a lesson in letting time and nature do the work. Children woke to the smell of the loaf cooling on the counter, a scent that spoke of skill and heritage. Salt-rising bread with bacon drippings remains a beloved emblem of Southern perseverance and the quiet mastery of age-old kitchen techniques. Cornmeal mush with drippings was the ultimate proof that Appalachian cooks could turn yesterday's leftovers into today's comfort. First, you stirred cornmeal into salted water until it thickened into a firm porridge, poured it into pans, and let it cool overnight. The next morning, those firm slabs were sliced and fried in hot bacon grease until the edges crisped brown and the centers stayed creamy and soft. The smell alone was enough to pull folks from their beds, as rich and tempting as any feast. Poured over with white gravy or syrup, it became a breakfast fit for a hard day's work. Families who had little knew how to stretch every grain, every drop of grease, and every bit of effort. The crackle from the skillet told them they had done it right. Cornmeal mush with drippings was more than a meal. It was a quiet triumph. It fed the body and reminded the heart that nothing had gone to waste. Each bite tasted like patience, creativity, and pride, the kind only born from making do. What began as simple porridge became a golden slice of home that fed generations through thick and thin. Smoked venison. Jerky ensured that nothing from a successful hunt went to waste and that meat would last through the long frozen months. Lean deer strips were salted generously and hung above a low smoldering fire for hours, sometimes days, until the smoke kissed every fiber and the moisture vanished. The process demanded patience and constant tending to keep the temperature steady without open flames. The result was a dark, chewy strip packed with protein and smoky depth that could be eaten on the trail without any preparation. Hunters and trappers stored the jerky in cloth bags or metal tins, confident it would keep through weeks of travel. Children gnawed on pieces like candy, and adults often crumbled bits into stews for an extra layer of flavor. Even today, jerky remains popular, but few modern versions capture the true wilderness taste of venison, slowly dried over real wood smoke while wind rustled through the trees and snow crept along the ground outside the camp. Benny seed cookies were small, nutty treats rooted in Gullah culture, treasured for both flavor and symbolism. Made with benny seeds, a type of sesame brought from Africa, these cookies were crisp, lightly sweet, and full of heritage. They were often baked for holidays, celebrations, or as gifts, carrying meaning beyond the plate. For generations, families passed down recipes, with each batch representing resilience and tradition. Children eagerly waited for them at special gatherings, their delicate crunch setting them apart from ordinary sweets. Unlike store-bought cookies, Benny seed cookies carried the weight of ancestry, a taste tied to identity. They showcased how African ingredients shaped Southern foodways in lasting ways. Today, they are rarely made outside of dedicated cultural circles or festivals, overshadowed by more mainstream desserts. Their absence reflects not just a shift in taste, but a loss of connection to history. Forgotten by many, Benny seed cookies remain a culinary treasure worth remembering for their story as much as their flavor. Creekbank smoked eels celebrated the quiet abundance of southern waterways, where families fished for more than just sport. Grandmothers cleaned freshly caught eels, rubbed them with salt and wild herbs, and hung them over smoldering hardwood fires along the creek's edge. Hours of slow smoking transformed the firm flesh into something tender and richly flavored with wood smoke and earth. Served alongside hot cornbread and a simple salad of foraged greens, the eel became a centerpiece that surprised those unfamiliar with its delicate taste. Children learned both fishing skills and respect for the land as they watched the careful preparation. This meal reflected a time when local rivers and creeks provided not only recreation but reliable sustenance. Creekbank smoked eel remains a vivid memory of evenings spent near moving water, when the fading light and curling smoke marked the rhythm of family life and the enduring connection between southern kitchens and the natural world that surrounded them. Pan-fried rattlesnake surprised many first-time eaters with its delicate white meat and mild flavor. Frontier hunters cleaned the snake carefully, removing the head and skin before slicing the body into manageable sections. Each piece was dredged in seasoned flour or cornmeal and fried in hot bacon fat until golden and crisp. The sizzling pan sent out a tempting aroma that challenged the bravest to take a bite. Those who did found a taste closer to chicken than they expected, firm yet tender with a faint hint of the wild desert. Sharing such a meal was a mark of courage and resourcefulness, proving that no edible creature was overlooked when supplies ran thin. Around campfires, the story of catching and cooking rattlesnake often became as memorable as the meal itself. While modern diners might hesitate, mountain men considered it a practical and surprisingly pleasant addition to their table, a testament to survival instincts and an adventurous spirit willing to turn danger into nourishment. Beans and taters were what kept mountain families going when there was little else to count on, the kind of meal that stretched far and satisfied deep. Pinto beans simmered low and long, softening with salt, fatback, or even just water when meat was short. Meanwhile, potatoes waited nearby, boiled, mashed, or fried crisp to turn a pot of beans into a full supper. Together, they made a plate that felt heavier than hunger and warmer than hardship. The beans brought body, the potatoes brought comfort, and the combination brought peace after long days. Mountain folks never needed fancy seasonings or sides. They just needed food that filled and soothed. Children knew the smell of beans simmering before they even came through the door. It was the smell of stability, of knowing you would eat, even in hard years. Beans and taters taught patience, gratitude, and the quiet pride that comes from surviving together. It was more than supper. It was a ritual that reminded families what mattered. Every forkful told the same story. Work hard, share what you have, and be thankful for enough. It was food for living, not showing off, and no one ever left hungry. Coffee-boiled beef turned the toughest cuts of meat into tender, flavorful dinners using an ingredient always present in a trapper's pack. Hunters browned the beef lightly, then poured in strong black coffee instead of water, letting the liquid work as both tenderizer and flavoring agent. As the meat simmered for hours, the coffee's bitterness mellowed into a deep, smoky richness that mingled with garlic, onions, and a pinch of salt. The result was beef that melted beneath a fork, infused with a subtle roasted taste unlike any ordinary stew. Around the fire, travelers relished the aroma that promised warmth and strength after long days of hauling gear or setting traps. This clever use of a morning staple showed how frontier cooks wasted nothing and found new purposes for familiar supplies. Today, the idea of simmering beef and coffee might surprise modern palates, but for mountain men, it was a trusted method that turned simple camp rations into a meal both satisfying and unexpectedly refined in its layered flavors. Hominy stew, inspired by native and African influences, was a hearty dish that showcased the South's diverse food routes. Made by simmering hominy corn with pork bones, onions, and peppers, it created a filling stew with smoky depth. It resembled pozole from native traditions, adapted by African-American cooks into regional variations. For rural households, it was an economical way to use cheap cuts and corn, stretching ingredients into something both nourishing and flavorful. Families gathered around bowls of it during cold nights, finding comfort in its simplicity. The dish also carried cultural history, reflecting centuries of blending traditions in Southern kitchens. Each spoonful connected communities across time, reminding people of resilience and shared heritage. Though once widespread, hominy stew has largely vanished from modern tables, overshadowed by canned soups and quicker meals. It remains a dish remembered in pockets of the South, where cooks keep old recipes alive. Its story is one of survival, adaptation, and flavor born from necessity. Spider pan. Apple stack delighted families with layers of skillet-fried apples built high like a rustic cake. Grandmothers sliced tart orchard apples thin and cooked them in a heavy spider pan, the old name for a cast-iron skillet with sturdy legs. Each batch was sprinkled with cane sugar and a touch of cinnamon, then carefully stacked while still hot, so the juices melded into a sticky, fragrant tower. The pan sat right on the hearth or over an open flame, filling the room with the comforting scent of caramelized fruit. Served warm, the stack could be sliced like a pie, releasing ribbons of sweet apple syrup with every cut. Children eagerly awaited their turn to watch the apples bubble and to taste the golden edges straight from the pan. Spider Pan Apple Stack reflects the Southern love of cast-iron cooking and the ability to create a show-stopping dessert with nothing more than orchard fruit, patience, and a steady hand at the hearth. Rabbit and dumplings was a meal that tasted like effort and reward mixed together, the kind that carried the story of the hunt straight to the supper table. Catching the rabbit was only half the work. The rest was done slow and steady in the kitchen. The meat was browned, simmered in broth until tender, and dropped into bubbling stock where floury dumplings waited to soak up every drop of flavor. Steam fogged the windows while the smell drifted through the house, wrapping around everyone like a promise of comfort. It was gamey, rich, and deeply satisfying, an old-world supper that turned survival into celebration. Every bite reminded folks that food earned by hand carried a different kind of pride. Families would sit quiet except for the clink of spoons and soft hums of contentment. Rabbit and dumplings filled bellies and hearts alike, warming even the coldest nights. It was country comfort at its finest, built from grit, gratitude, and a little wild luck. In mountain homes, it stood as proof that patience and hard work always paid off. The meal may have been humble, but the feeling it brought was priceless. Home, warmth, and a kind of joy you could only taste. Trapper's pemmican was the ultimate trail ration, dense and enduring, a food designed to keep travelers alive across endless miles of rough terrain. Hunters dried lean strips of game meat in open air or smokehouses until every trace of moisture vanished, then pounded them with stones into a fine powder. Dried berries such as chokecherries were crushed and mixed with the meat before hot-rendered fat bound it all into a solid mass. Packed into rawhide bags, pemmican could last for months without spoiling, providing a powerful balance of protein and energy that fueled trappers through snowstorms and long hunts. Small pieces were eaten as is, while larger chunks could be boiled with water to create a quick stew on frigid nights. It required no fire, no cooking, only careful preparation and respect for survival knowledge passed from indigenous peoples to the mountain men who adopted it. Few modern snacks carry such history or concentrated strength, a reminder that the simplest ingredients once meant the difference between life and death on the frontier. Chess pie with vinegar was one of the South's thriftiest desserts, proving that even the poorest households could enjoy something sweet. Made from sugar, eggs, butter, and a splash of vinegar, it baked into a custard-like pie with a tangy edge. The vinegar cut the sweetness, balancing the richness of the filling and making it unique. Families loved chess pie because the ingredients were always on hand, no matter how tight the budget. It was served at Sunday dinners, holidays, and gatherings, offering comfort and familiarity. While fancier pies required fruit or nuts, chess pie was humble and practical, making it beloved across generations. Children often remembered it as the dessert of their childhood, while adults prized it for its simplicity. Today, it is less common outside of heritage cookbooks, replaced by more modern sweets. Chess pie with vinegar stands as a symbol of Depression-era resilience, turning pantry basics into something remarkable. Forgotten now, it remains a dish worth remembering for both its flavor and history. Frost grape jam thumbprint. Cookies captured the fleeting sweetness of wild grapes that only reached perfection after the first frost softened their tart skins. Grandmothers ventured into thickets to gather the small, dark clusters, then simmered them into a deep purple jam that filled kitchens with a heady autumn aroma. For the cookies, they prepared a buttery dough, pressing small wells into each round and spooning in the glossy jam before baking. As the cookies cooled, the jam set into jewel-like centers that gleamed against the golden crust. Children loved to help with the thumbprints, their tiny fingerprints leaving a family mark on every treat. These cookies often appeared at holiday gatherings when the weather turned crisp and the harvest season closed, carrying with them the taste of chilly mornings and wood smoke. Frost grape jam. Thumbprint cookies endure as a symbol of resourcefulness and celebration, a sweet way to preserve the last gifts of the wild before winter settled firmly across the southern hills. Cabbage and ham hock soup was the kind of dinner that filled both bellies and souls when times were thin and money ran out. The hock, tough and bony but rich with hidden flavor, simmered for hours until the meat fell away and the broth turned smoky. Chopped cabbage leaves, onions, and potatoes joined the pot, soaking up the taste that only slow cooking and patience could bring. The kitchen filled with steam and scent, proof that comfort was brewing even without much to spare. It was not fancy, but it fed families for days and cost next to nothing. In mountain kitchens, the secret was never waste. It was making do and making magic from scraps. The sound of the spoon scraping the pot was the sound of gratitude itself. Every bowl carried the story of thrift and resilience. A steaming ladle served on a cold evening felt like victory over hardship. Even with little meat, the broth was rich, the cabbage sweet, and the memory lasting. Ham hock soup reminded everyone that love and labor make the best seasoning of all. It was humble food, but it held more comfort than gold ever could. Forager's mushroom. Ragu transformed a handful of wild mushrooms into a meal that tasted of deep forest soil and clean rain. Hunters gathered chanterelles, morels, or other seasonal finds at first light, brushing off pine needles and slicing them into rustic pieces. In a heavy skillet, they melted bacon fat with garlic and wild onions until the fragrance filled the clearing, then tossed in the mushrooms to sear and release their earthy juices. A splash of spring water or a spoon of cream, if available, created a silky sauce that clung to each tender bite. Served over bread or with a side of roasted roots, the ragu delivered warmth and rich umami to those who spent their days in silence among towering trees. This dish celebrated knowledge of the land, for it required careful identification and respect for nature's offerings. Modern cooks may buy farmed mushrooms year-round, but they cannot capture the sense of discovery and quiet reward that came from gathering a meal straight from the shadowed floor of the wilderness. Pineapple. Upside-down cake in cast iron was once the ultimate Southern hostess dessert, a showpiece that combined practicality with flair. It was made by layering canned pineapple rings, cherries, and brown sugar in the bottom of a cast iron skillet, then pouring cake batter on top. After baking, the cake was flipped out to reveal a golden caramelized topping that dazzled guests. This dish thrived in the mid-20th century, when canned fruit became widely available and affordable. It quickly became a centerpiece at church suppers, potlucks, and holiday gatherings. Children were enchanted by its bright colors, while adults admired its sweet, buttery flavor. The cast iron skillet made it accessible since nearly every household had one, and it ensured even cooking and a crisp edge. Though it once symbolized Southern hospitality and creativity, it has mostly disappeared from modern tables, overshadowed by convenience desserts. Today, it survives only in nostalgic memory, reminding us of a time when a single cake could capture the joy of a community. Chinquapin chestnut dressing showcased a tiny nut once abundant in southern forests, but nearly lost by the mid-20th century. Grandmothers gathered the small chestnuts, cracking their thin shells to reveal sweet, dense meat that added depth to traditional bread stuffing. Mixed with crumbled cornbread, onions, and sage, the dressing baked to a golden crust that perfumed the kitchen with warm, earthy notes. Because the Chinquapin harvest was unpredictable, this dish was reserved for holidays or special Sunday dinners, making it a treasured seasonal event. Children joined the harvest, their pockets filling with the glossy brown nuts that hid beneath fallen leaves. Each bite of the finished dressing carried the flavor of autumn woods and the satisfaction of a successful forage. Chinquapin chestnut dressing stands today as a memory of forests once thick with these small treasures and of the grandmothers who taught that the rarest ingredients often come from careful observation and the patient work of many small hands. Corn fritters with sorghum syrup were the kind of treat that made even the hardest days end on a sweet note. Fresh corn was grated right off the cob, mixed with egg and cornmeal, then dropped into hot grease until puffed and golden. Each fritter sizzled with that unmistakable sound of something good cooking. You could eat them plain with a pinch of salt, or drizzle them with dark, sticky sorghum syrup for a dessert that tasted like sunshine and soil. The syrup itself was a treasure. Boiled down slow from cane juice, thick as honey and twice as rich. It was poured with care because every drop was earned through long days of turning the mill. Corn fritters were a fair reward for that labor, shared hot from the pan between laughter and stories. Their crisp edges and soft centers made them perfect for breakfast or supper alike. It was the kind of food that did not need a recipe, just memory and feeling, passed down from one careful cook to another. Simple, honest, and always satisfying. Iron pot split. Pea soup with salted ham hock was the slow-simmered comfort that sustained hunters through the bitterest winter nights. Dried peas soaked in cool water overnight were poured into a heavy pot along with chunks of smoked ham hock and a scattering of onions and carrots. The mixture bubbled gently beside the hearth for hours, the peas breaking down into a creamy base while the pork released deep smoky flavor. The scent filled cabins and canvas tents alike, promising warmth and nourishment when snow drifted high against the walls. Served with coarse bread or a slice of bannock, each bowl offered steady energy for long days of trapping or chopping wood. Children slurped it eagerly, the rich broth clinging to their spoons and warming their hands. This soup required little more than time and patience, yet delivered both comfort and vital strength. Today, quick-dried mixes cannot match the depth of flavor earned by a night of slow cooking over glowing coals and the quiet satisfaction of a meal born from simple ingredients. Field pea salad was a thrifty dish that made the most of seasonal legumes, mixing fresh field peas with peppers, onions, and vinegar. Served chilled, it was a refreshing side for hot southern summers, often brought to church picnics or family reunions. The tang of vinegar balanced the earthiness of the peas, making it both simple and satisfying. Families appreciated it as a cheap, garden-based dish that stretched across gatherings. Children often picked peas from pods, their small hands helping prepare what would later fill large bowls. Field pea salad was more than just food, it represented the connection between gardens and tables, showing how nothing went to waste. Its bright flavors stood out among heavier southern fare, giving balance to meals. Today, it has slipped from popularity, replaced by mayonnaise-heavy salads and modern sides. Forgotten in many kitchens, its memory lingers in old recipe boxes. Field pea salad was proof that even the humblest ingredients could shine when handled with care. Sourwood honey pone delivered the essence of Appalachian mountain summers in a simple yet unforgettable corn cake. Grandmothers blended fresh ground cornmeal with buttermilk and farm eggs, then stirred in a generous drizzle of rare sourwood honey gathered from high mountain hives. Baked in a cast iron skillet, the pone emerged with a golden crust and a moist crumb sweetened with the floral, slightly tangy notes of the honey. Families prize this treat because sourwood blooms for only a short season, making the honey a cherished ingredient that neighbors often traded like gold. Served warm with fresh butter, each slice carried the fragrance of mountain flowers and the warmth of hearth and home. Children savored every bite, aware that the next taste might be a year away. Sourwood honey pone remains a beloved memory of the Appalachian hills, where natural bounty and careful timing combined to create a dish that was as fleeting as it was delicious. Fried green tomatoes with cornmeal crust were the South's way of saying waste nothing, because even an unripe tomato could still shine. When the vines hung heavy with fruit that would not turn red in time, thrifty hands sliced them thick, dusted them in cornmeal, and dropped them into sizzling bacon grease. The kitchen came alive with that familiar pop and crackle, the sound of hunger about to be satisfied. The slices fried golden and crisp, tart inside and smoky outside, a perfect blend of garden freshness and skillet comfort. They were often served beside beans, greens, or gravy, completing a meal that cost almost nothing but tasted like plenty. Each bite carried the flavor of hard work, sunshine, and summer's patience. Mothers never measured, they just knew when the batter was right, and kids learned to flip them when the edges turned brown. Fried green tomatoes were proof that nothing in the South went to waste. Not time, not food, not love. They were simple, dependable, and unforgettable. The first bite snapped with tang, the last ended in quiet satisfaction. In every kitchen that made them, thrift became art, and every plate told the same story: make do and make it delicious. Mountain Man breakfast skillet greeted dawn with a hearty mix designed to carry workers through the toughest day. Potatoes diced small fried first in bacon grease until edges turned crisp, followed by onions, peppers, and scraps of last night's venison or elk. Finally, eggs were cracked directly into the sizzling mixture, their yolks mingling with the rich drippings to coat every bite. The aroma filled the campsite long before the sun crested the peaks, drawing even the most exhausted hunter from his blanket. This breakfast was never fancy but always reliable, offering protein, starch, and fat in perfect balance for long hikes or chopping wood. Families sitting near the fire shared the skillet straight from the pan, passing wooden forks and stories as steam curled into the morning air. Today, diners serve similar dishes, but the true Mountain Man version carries the unmistakable taste of open flame and fresh game, a flavor of pure endurance that cannot be recreated by any restaurant range or packaged seasoning mix. These skills kept families alive through the worst the mountain could throw at them. Which one do you still wish someone had taught you?